For Emma, her blanket was her comfort, her shield from the unknown. It was the only item she'd carried through every phase of her life, stitched with care by her grandmother, its patchwork of fabric squares each told a story. She used it during chilly winter nights, draped it over herself during childhood thunderstorms, and even brought it to college. It had never let her down. Until now. She'd recently moved into an old Victorian house, nestled on the edge of a quiet town. The house had charm, creaky floorboards, high ceilings, and a faint scent of lavender in the air. But the nights were unrelentingly cold, and the blanket that once provided her warmth felt heavier than ever. The first night, Emma tossed and turned. The room felt off, quiet in a way that wasn't peaceful. Her blanket felt suffocating, as if the weight of the years stitched into it had compounded somehow. Dismissing it as moving day nerves, she pulled the blanket tighter and tried to fall asleep. But sleep didn't come easy. She dreamt of her grandmother, sitting by the fire and sewing, as her face grew progressively darker, her eyes reflecting flames. When Emma woke, the blanket was bunched up tightly around her neck, pinning her to the bed. Her breathing was shallow, heart racing. She convinced herself it was just a bad dream, a coincidence. The second night, Emma made a mental note to relax before bed. She poured herself a glass of wine, watched a feel-good movie, and placed a small night light in the corner of her room. That should do it, she thought. Wrapping herself in the blanket, she tried to let its weight soothe her. The patchwork pattern stared back at her, reminding her of simpler times. She smiled and closed her eyes. Somewhere around 2 a.m. the weight grew unbearable again. This time she couldn't lift it. Emma panicked, thrashing underneath its grip. It clung to her like a vice, forcing her deeper into the mattress. Her arms, her legs, everything felt trapped. The blanket was moving. Beneath its fabric, something shifted and pressed against her body. She screamed, finally managing to shove the blanket to the floor. It landed in a heap, quivering as if alive. Emma didn't dare pick it up. She slept on the couch that night, wrapped in a different throw. In the light of day, things seemed clearer. Stress, she told herself over her coffee. It has to be stress. Determined not to let a blanket ruin her peace, she gingerly picked it up off the bedroom floor. Nothing moved, it felt limp, lifeless. The patchwork smiled back at her, innocently nostalgic. For all the years it had been with her, Emma had never truly examined the blanket. She flipped it over and ran her hands along the seams, but something felt wrong. One square, a faded crimson one, was rough to the touch, its fabric worn thin. Had it always been that way? She pressed against the square. It sunk inward, almost like there was space beneath it. Unable to ignore her curiosity, Emma grabbed a pair of scissors and began to cut the stitching on the crimson square. As she peeled it back, something fell out. A lock of hair, long and silvery white. It was tied with a piece of string. Her stomach churned. No, she muttered, shaking her head. It had to be her grandmother's hair, kept there for sentimental reasons. That was the explanation, wasn't it? Yet beneath the hair she found more. A small scrap of fabric soaked through with a brownish red stain and a brittle piece of paper with something scrawled on it in faded ink. Keep it quiet. Keep it warm. Don't let it wake. Emma dropped the blanket and staggered back, her hands trembling. She couldn't just leave the blanket there. Night came too quickly in the old house, and the shadows crept in early. Despite every rational instinct, she felt drawn to it, as though abandoning it might be worse than keeping it. She tried to sleep again on the couch, the blanket folded and tucked away in the linen closet, but her dreams wouldn't let her rest. She saw her grandmother again, only now her face was featureless, a blank expanse. She held up the blanket in gnarled hands and spoke, her voice hollow and distant. You broke the seal, Emma. You can't let it out. Not here. Emma awoke with a gasp, her body drenched in sweat. Her heart sank as she turned to face the linen closet. The door was wide open. The blanket wasn't where she'd left it. Faint whispers echoed through the house, growing louder, more urgent. Shadows pooled in corners where there shouldn't have been darkness. When Emma stepped into the living room, the blanket was there, sprawled across the couch. It seemed stretched unnaturally, as though the fabric beneath was swelling. Something moved inside, and the faint shape of a hand pressed against the surface. "Keep it quiet," the whispers repeated, now clear, overlapping in chaotic layers. Emma covered her ears, backing away. The crimson square glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. The shape inside began pushing harder against the fabric. A sound, wet and ripping, came from the blanket. I didn't mean to," Emma cried out, unable to look away as the stitches snapped one by one. A blackened, skeletal hand tore through the fabric, dragging its frail body into the room. Its head was hollow, its eyes deep voids, and its bony fingers clutched at the air, reaching for Emma. She ran. She didn't stop to grab her keys or phone, just bolted into the night. When she reached the main road, the house seemed to shimmer, its outline flickering as though it were no longer fully part of this world. Behind her, the whispers continued, louder now, chasing her. That night, Emma slept in her car, parked at a gas station miles from the house. Days later, police arrived to investigate her abandoned home. All they found was an empty house and a tattered blanket lying in the center of the living room. Its crimson square had faded completely, leaving no trace behind.